She called the black man unworthy, but the billionaire CEO woman soon realized she needed saving. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. And now, let's return to the main character. His name is Marcus Reed, a black man whose presence rarely announced itself before he spoke, not because he lacked confidence, but because life had taught him that quiet steadiness often traveled farther than noise. And on this particular morning, standing just outside a glass-walled corporate building that rose nearly 40 stories into a gray Chicago sky, Marcus had no intention of drawing attention to himself at all. He wore clean work boots, a neatly pressed jacket, and the calm expression of someone who had already learned how to be patient with other people's assumptions. Inside the building the pace was fast. Assistants hurried across polished floors. Elevators chimed every few seconds, and conversations were clipped and purposeful. This was the headquarters of Hale Dynamics, a company whose name alone carried weight in boardrooms across the country. And at the center of that world was Victoria Hale, a billionaire CEO known for her precision, her control, and her unshakable belief that she could assess a person's value within seconds. When Marcus finally stepped through the security checkpoint, the room shifted in subtle ways. Eyes flicked toward him, then away, measuring, categorizing, deciding. He was not there to challenge anyone, not to impress, not to ask for recognition. He was there because he had been told to come. Because sometimes responsibility meant showing up even when you knew the welcome would be thin. Victoria noticed him almost immediately. Her gaze was sharp, practiced, and dismissive, and when their eyes met, there was no curiosity there. Only judgment formed too quickly to be questioned. A brief exchange followed, polite on the surface, but edged with condescension, and then the words slipped out. Unworthy, spoken casually, as if it were a simple fact rather than a sentence passed on another human being. The room went still for a heartbeat. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others pretended not to notice. Marcus felt the weight of the moment, but he did not react the way many expected. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not defend his past or explain his worth. He simply acknowledged the comment with a calm nod, the kind that comes from a man who understands that dignity does not require permission. And as the conversation moved on without him, something important was set into motion, though no one in that room could see it yet. Because in that quiet space between assumption and truth, Marcus Reed stood exactly where he needed to be, and Victoria Hale, certain of her judgment, had no idea that the person she had just dismissed would soon become the one presence she could not ignore. The meeting resumed as if nothing significant had happened, yet the atmosphere carried a subtle tension that lingered in the air like static before a storm. Marcus Reed stepped back toward the edge of the room, giving space, allowing the flow of authority to move around him without resistance. He had learned long ago that silence could be mistaken for weakness by those who relied on volume to assert themselves. But silence, when chosen, was a form of control. From across the table, Victoria Hale continued directing the discussion with crisp confidence, her voice steady, her posture composed. She outlined projections, timelines, and expectations with the certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The board members nodded, assistants typed notes, and decisions were recorded without hesitation. Yet despite the forward momentum, her attention flickered back to Marcus more than once, not out of concern, but out of mild irritation, as if his quiet presence disrupted the neat order she preferred. Marcus noticed this but gave no sign. He focused instead on the details around him, the muted hum of the building's climate system, the faint reflection of city traffic far below through the glass, the rhythm of corporate life moving at a pace that often forgot the people it carried along. When the meeting concluded, chairs shifted and voices rose again, polite smiles returned, and the room emptied quickly. Marcus waited until he was certain no one expected anything from him, then turned toward the exit. He moved without hurry, because urgency was a luxury he did not indulge in unless it truly mattered. Outside the conference room, the hallway stretched long and bright, lined with framed awards and headlines celebrating Hale Dynamics' success. Victoria emerged moments later, speaking to an assistant, her tone efficient, already transitioning to the next priority. She passed Marcus without acknowledgement, convinced that the encounter had ended exactly where it should have. Yet as she walked away, an unexpected thought surfaced, brief and unwelcome. Something about the way he had accepted her words without shrinking had unsettled her. She dismissed it quickly, attributing the feeling to fatigue. Marcus exited the building and stepped onto the sidewalk. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through the morning air, carrying the familiar sounds of buses, footsteps, and distant horns. He paused for a moment, not out of frustration, but reflection. Moments like these reminded him why he chose restraint over reaction, because life had taught him that dignity did not need witnesses. To exist, he adjusted his jacket and continued down the block, blending into the flow of the city. While several floors above, Victoria stood by her office window, scanning reports on a tablet. Yet her focus wavered. She replayed the moment again, the ease with which she had labeled him, the absence of protest in his eyes. It was not guilt she felt, but confusion, an unfamiliar sensation for someone who trusted her instincts implicitly. She shook her head and returned to work, unaware that this small crack in her certainty would widen sooner than she expected. As the day progressed, Marcus carried on with responsibilities that rarely came with recognition, balancing commitments with the quiet determination of someone used to being underestimated. He made calls, checked on details others overlooked, and ensured things moved forward without friction. His actions were not dramatic, but they were precise, and precision had a way of becoming invaluable over time. By late afternoon, circumstances began aligning in subtle ways, threads pulling toward a future neither of them could yet see. Marcus remained steady, grounded in the knowledge that truth revealed itself when given enough space, while Victoria, surrounded by power and privilege, continued forward unaware that the foundation she relied on was less secure than she believed, and that the man she had dismissed that morning would soon occupy her thoughts in ways she could not yet explain. The following morning unfolded with deceptive normalcy, the kind that lulled powerful people into believing their systems were unshakable. Marcus Reed began his day before sunrise, as he often did, preparing breakfast, checking schedules, and reviewing notes with the quiet discipline of someone who understood that preparation was not optional. It was survival. He moved through his small apartment with efficiency, every action measured, every decision intentional. While across the city, Victoria Hale arrived at her office earlier than usual, driven by a restless energy she could not quite name. Overnight updates had arrived from multiple departments, numbers that looked solid on the surface but carried inconsistencies beneath. She dismissed the first few concerns raised by her executives, confident that minor deviations were inevitable at her scale. Yet as the morning progressed, the issues compounded. Suppliers delayed confirmations. A partner requested clarification on terms that should have been settled weeks ago, and a key internal report failed to align with projections she had personally approved. Irritation crept into her voice as she demanded explanations. Her team scrambled to reassure her, but reassurance without clarity only deepened her frustration. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself pulled into a series of conversations that revealed the same underlying problem from a different angle. He listened more than he spoke, asking careful questions, noting gaps others rushed past. His role placed him just close enough to see the fault lines without being invited into the rooms where decisions were made. And it was there, in those overlooked spaces, that patterns emerged. He recognized a familiar structure, a system built too quickly on confidence rather than continuity. As the hours passed, Marcus quietly made calls, confirmed timelines, and traced responsibilities back to their source. He did not accuse, did not alarm. He simply gathered truth. By midday, Victoria convened another meeting, her patience thinning. She demanded solutions, not observations. But solutions remained elusive. One executive hesitated before mentioning that certain assumptions might have been flawed from the start. Victoria dismissed the suggestion sharply, her authority filling the room like pressure. Yet when the meeting ended, she was left with fewer answers than before. Alone in her office, she stared out at the city below, the traffic inching along streets she rarely walked, and for the first time in years, Doubt surfaced without invitation. She remembered Marcus. Read again, not his words, because he had offered none, but his composure, the way he had stood unmoved by her judgment. It irritated her. Now for a different reason, as if his silence had concealed something she had missed, she brushed the thought aside and returned to work, unaware that within the same building, several floors below, Marcus was already addressing the very issue she could not name. He coordinated calmly, redirecting efforts, correcting assumptions, and restoring alignment where it had slipped. No announcements accompanied his actions, no recognition followed. But progress began to register, small delays resolved themselves, confusion gave way to clarity, and by late afternoon, the momentum shifted subtly. Victoria noticed the change in metrics first. The numbers stabilized, the questions slowed, relief washed over her team, yet she could not pinpoint what had caused the shift. She requested a summary, expecting a familiar name, but instead received a chain of actions traced back indirectly, leading to Marcus Reed. The name lingered on the screen longer than she expected. She felt a flicker of discomfort, quickly masked by curiosity. How had someone she deemed unworthy influenced outcomes without stepping into her line of sight? She leaned back in her chair, the polished confidence she wore like armor beginning to feel heavier than usual. Marcus ended his day as quietly as it had begun, walking home as the sun dipped behind the skyline. Satisfied not with recognition, but with resolution, he knew this pattern well. Crises revealed character, not immediately, but inevitably, and somewhere above him, in an office filled with glass and certainty, Victoria Hale was beginning to sense that control alone was not enough, and that the absence of one man's voice might soon become impossible to ignore. The next few days settled into a cautious rhythm, one where outward stability masked an undercurrent of uncertainty. Marcus Reed continued operating in the margins, where expectations were low and visibility was limited, yet his influence quietly expanded as more people began seeking his input. Without quite admitting why, he responded the same way each time, listening carefully, offering clarity without ego, and stepping back once order was restored. His approach was not about authority, it was about responsibility, something he had learned long before corporate hallways became part of his life. Meanwhile, Victoria Hale found herself reviewing reports with a sharper eye. Patterns she once skimmed now demanded attention, and more than once she noticed Marcus's name attached to processes that had stabilized recent issues. It unsettled her not because of what he had done, but because she had not seen it happening. One afternoon she asked an assistant to compile a brief overview of who had coordinated recent corrections, expecting a familiar executive. But again the trail pointed quietly to Marcus. The assistant hesitated before explaining that he was often consulted informally, trusted by teams who valued precision over presentation. Victoria dismissed the assistant with a curt nod, but the information lingered, forcing her to confront an uncomfortable truth. Effectiveness did not always announce itself. Later that week, a minor but sensitive situation arose involving a delayed compliance review. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to attract scrutiny if mishandled. Victoria's leadership team debated approaches, voices overlapping, urgency rising. Yet no clear resolution emerged. Almost without thinking, Victoria asked if Marcus Reed was available. The room went quiet for a fraction of a second before someone confirmed that he was in the building. The request surprised even her, but she did not retract it. When Marcus entered the room, his demeanor unchanged, respectful but grounded, Victoria outlined the issue succinctly, watching him closely, expecting hesitation or deference. Instead, he asked a few measured questions, clarifying timelines, responsibilities, and communication gaps. He did not contradict anyone directly, but reframed the problem until its shape became unmistakable. Within minutes, the tension eased. A practical path forward revealed itself, and the meeting concluded with a sense of relief that felt disproportionate to the simplicity of the solution. Marcus thanked the room and prepared to leave, but Victoria stopped him, not with authority, but with curiosity. She asked how he had seen the solution so quickly. Marcus answered honestly, explaining that he had encountered similar structures before, systems that assumed alignment without verifying it. His tone carried no accusation, only observation. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing his words. After he left, She remained seated longer than usual, replaying the exchange. The ease with which he had navigated complexity contrasted sharply with her own reliance on control. Later that evening, as city lights flickered on below her office, Victoria reflected on the first day she had labeled him unworthy. The word now felt careless, even lazy. She did not yet regret it, but she questioned it, which for her was a significant shift. Marcus ended his day the same way he often did, picking up his child from a neighbor's apartment, listening attentively to stories about school and small victories that mattered more than any corporate outcome. He prepared dinner, helped with homework, and moved through the routines that grounded him. Unaware of how often his name now surfaced in spaces he never sought to enter, he slept without concern for recognition, trusting that consistency would speak when the time was right. Back at Hale Dynamics, Victoria reviewed her calendar for the following week and made a small adjustment. She scheduled a one-on-one meeting with Marcus Reed. Not framed as a command, but as a conversation. She told herself it was purely professional, yet something deeper stirred beneath the surface. A realization forming slowly, that leadership built on judgment alone was fragile, and that the quiet man she once dismissed might be holding a mirror she had long avoided. The scheduled meeting arrived sooner than Marcus Reed expected, not because time moved quickly, but because he rarely measured his days by appointments with executives. When the notification came through confirming the one-on-one discussion with Victoria Hale, he acknowledged it without reaction, treating it as he treated everything else, a responsibility to approach with clarity and respect. The morning of the meeting unfolded calmly. Marcus completed his usual tasks, ensured everything under his care was in order, and arrived at the building a few minutes early, not out of eagerness, but habit. Victoria, on the other hand, spent more time preparing than she intended to admit. She reviewed Marcus's background, his recent contributions, and the indirect impact he had made across several departments. The more she read, the clearer it became that her earlier judgment had been based on surface impressions rather than substance, a realization that unsettled her far more than any operational setback. When Marcus entered her office, the atmosphere shifted subtly, not with tension, but with awareness. Victoria gestured for him to sit, her tone professional, controlled, yet noticeably less sharp than before. She began by acknowledging the recent improvements within the company, carefully choosing her words. Marcus listened attentively, offering brief affirmations without interruption. When she asked for his perspective, he responded thoughtfully, outlining observations, without assigning blame, focusing instead on structure, communication, and long-term sustainability. His approach was neither defensive nor deferential. It was grounded, and that groundedness challenged Victoria more than opposition ever could. As the conversation continued, she found herself asking questions she had not planned, about how he identified issues so efficiently, how he built trust across teams without formal authority. Marcus answered simply, explaining that trust grew when people felt seen and heard, when problems were addressed rather than ignored. His words carried the weight of experience rather than theory, and Victoria felt something shift internally, not admiration, but recognition. The meeting concluded without dramatic resolution. No apologies spoken, no promises made. Yet when Marcus stood to leave, Victoria thanked him, genuinely. The word felt unfamiliar on her tongue in that context, but necessary. Marcus nodded and exited, carrying on with his day as usual, unaware that the encounter had left a deeper impression than any presentation ever had. Throughout the afternoon, Victoria's confidence returned outwardly. She moved through meetings, issued directives, and maintained the polished authority she was known for. But beneath it all, a quiet recalibration was taking place. She began delegating differently, listening longer, questioning assumptions she once accepted without hesitation. Her power remained intact, but its expression softened, not weakened. While Marcus continued operating without change, focused on consistency rather than recognition, he did not discuss the meeting, did not speculate about its meaning, because he understood that real change revealed itself over time, not in isolated conversations. That evening, Victoria reviewed her schedule again and noticed how often Marcus's involvement appeared as a stabilizing factor. The pattern was undeniable now. She recalled the words she had once used to describe him and felt a flicker of discomfort. Not regret yet, but awareness, the kind that preceded accountability. She realized that her success had been built on decisive judgment, but that same instinct had blinded her to value she did not immediately recognize. Marcus spent his evening at home, helping his child with a school project, listening patiently, offering guidance without control, the same principles he applied everywhere else. Leadership through presence rather than dominance. As the city settled into night, two lives continued on parallel paths, one rooted in quiet consistency, the other beginning to question the foundations of its certainty. Neither knew exactly where the shift would lead, but the distance between dismissal and dependence had begun to close, not through confrontation, but through the steady erosion of assumption by truth. The shift became noticeable not through announcements, but through pressure, the kind that tested systems quietly before revealing their weakest points. Within a week, Hale Dynamics faced a situation that money alone could not smooth over. A strategic partnership that had taken months to secure began showing signs of strain. Expectations between both sides no longer aligned. Timelines slipped, and trust wavered beneath polite communications. Victoria Hale was informed early in the morning, the update delivered with careful wording that failed to mask its seriousness. She listened without interruption, her expression composed. Yet internally, she recognized the warning signs. This was not a problem that could be solved by authority or urgency. Every instinct urged her to step in decisively, but she hesitated, recalling recent lessons she had not yet fully accepted. She requested additional details, not directives, and asked who had been involved in maintaining communication. Once again, Marcus Reed's name surfaced, not as a lead negotiator, but as someone teams consulted when clarity was needed. Victoria felt a familiar tightening in her chest, not irritation this time, but awareness. She scheduled a briefing and requested Marcus's presence, framing it as collaborative rather than corrective. Marcus arrived with the same calm demeanor, listening carefully as the situation was explained. He asked thoughtful questions, focusing on what had been promised, what had been assumed, and where silence had replaced confirmation. His approach slowed the conversation, grounding it, and as he spoke, the issue revealed itself not as a conflict, but a misalignment allowed to grow unchecked. Victoria watched closely, noticing how his words redirected attention without challenging authority. He did not position himself as a solution, but as a lens through which the problem could be seen clearly. When asked what he recommended, Marcus suggested a measured response, one that prioritized transparency over leverage, understanding over pressure. It was not the fastest option, nor the most aggressive, but it was the most stable. Victoria considered the recommendation carefully, aware that accepting it meant trusting someone she had once dismissed publicly. The decision weighed on her, but she nodded, authorizing the approach. The room responded with cautious optimism. Over the following days, the plan unfolded steadily, communication improved, assumptions were clarified, and the partnership stabilized without spectacle. Progress was slow but unmistakable. Victoria received updates that reflected genuine alignment rather than temporary compliance. She felt relief, but also something deeper, a recognition that this outcome would not have been possible through force alone. She began consulting Marcus more frequently, not formally, but intentionally, asking for perspective before decisions were finalized. Marcus remained consistent, offering insight without seeking influence, his role expanding naturally as trust followed results. Outside the office, life continued at its own pace. Marcus balanced his responsibilities with the steady presence his child relied on, routines that reinforced his values daily, while Victoria found her evenings occupied by reflection more than before, reviewing not just outcomes, but processes, questioning where her certainty had once replaced curiosity. One night, alone in her office long after most lights had gone out, she replayed the early moment when she had labeled Marcus unworthy. The memory no longer sat quietly. It pressed against her conscience. She did not excuse it, but she did not yet confront it either. Instead, she acknowledged a truth that unsettled her deeply. The stability she depended on was increasingly tied to the man she had underestimated, not because he demanded relevance, but because he embodied it through action. Marcus sensed the change but did not name it. He understood that dependence did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it revealed itself through silence, through who was consulted when pressure rose, through whose absence would now be felt as the week closed. Victoria prepared for an upcoming board review, aware that questions would arise, confident in the company's direction, yet conscious that her leadership was evolving. She no longer equated control with strength, and somewhere in that realization lay the quiet truth she was not yet ready to speak aloud, that the man she once dismissed had become essential not by force, but by integrity, and that her success was now intertwined with a presence she could no longer overlook. The board review arrived with the polished intensity Victoria Hale was known for orchestrating. Executives gathered around the long table as screens displayed performance metrics that told a reassuring story on the surface. Yet beneath the numbers lay a tension Victoria could feel even as she spoke with confidence. Questions from board members came measured and precise, probing areas that had recently shown instability. Victoria answered smoothly, outlining corrective steps and emphasizing long-term alignment. But as the discussion deepened, a familiar pattern emerged. Several improvements traced back not to top-level directives, but to operational clarity achieved quietly behind the scenes. One board member asked who had been coordinating these adjustments across departments. Victoria paused for a fraction of a second, a pause so brief most would miss it, before responding truthfully. She mentioned Marcus Reed, not with flourish, but with accuracy. The name settled into the room differently than she expected. Some nodded, others exchanged brief looks. One member remarked that he had heard positive things about Marcus's reliability. Another added that teams seemed unusually cohesive lately. Victoria listened, absorbing the comments with a mixture of surprise and restrained acknowledgement. She realized then that Marcus's reputation had grown independently of her endorsement, shaped by consistent results rather than authority. After the meeting concluded, she returned to her office feeling both relieved and unsettled. The success she presented rested increasingly on a foundation she had not built alone, and more importantly, on a person she had once dismissed without thought. Later that afternoon, an unexpected situation arose. A senior executive called in sick on the same day a critical internal review was scheduled. The timing was far from ideal. Victoria assessed her options quickly. Rescheduling would signal weakness. Delegating upward would strain already stretched resources. Without overthinking it, she asked if Marcus could step in to facilitate the discussion. The request felt natural now. Though she was aware of how far that instinct had shifted, Marcus accepted without hesitation, approaching the task with the same steady focus he applied to everything else. The meeting proceeded efficiently. Questions were addressed, concerns acknowledged, and next steps clarified without escalation. When Victoria reviewed the summary afterward, she noticed how smoothly it had unfolded, not because problems were avoided, but because they were handled with clarity and respect. That evening, as Victoria prepared to leave the office, she found herself reflecting on the trajectory of the past weeks. The early certainty she once relied on felt distant, replaced by a more complex understanding of leadership, one that required humility as much as decisiveness. She recalled the word she had used, unworthy, and felt its weight more acutely now, not as an accusation against Marcus, but as an indictment of her own assumptions. She did not yet know how to address it, but she knew she could no longer ignore it. Marcus's day ended as it often did, with quiet routines that grounded him. He prepared dinner, listened attentively to his child's stories, and offered guidance with patience rather than control. These moments reinforced the values that shaped every other part of his life: consistency, presence, and accountability. He did not measure success by titles or recognition, but by stability and trust. Back at Hale Dynamics, Victoria lingered in her office longer than usual. Reviewing notes from the day, Marcus's name appeared repeatedly, not highlighted, not emphasized, simply present where things worked. She realized then that his influence had reached a point where its absence would be noticeable. A subtle dependence had formed, not declared, but undeniable. She closed her laptop and stared out at the city lights, understanding that something fundamental had changed, not just in how the company operated, but in how she saw the people within it. The man she once labeled without hesitation had become a quiet constant, and that realization carried an uncomfortable truth she was inching closer to facing. That real strength was not found in judgment passed quickly, but in character revealed over time, and that Marcus Reed had earned a place in her world without ever asking for one. The moment Victoria Hale realized she could no longer treat Marcus Reed as a background presence came quietly, without crisis or spectacle. It arrived in the form of a decision she hesitated to make alone, a strategic adjustment that would affect several departments and require careful coordination. In the past, she would have finalized it herself, issued directives, and expected compliance. But now she found herself pausing, considering how the change would ripple through systems she no longer viewed as purely mechanical. After several minutes of deliberation, she did something she had not planned when she began her day. She asked her assistant to schedule time with Marcus, not as a review, not as a task assignment, but as a conversation. The phrasing mattered to her more than she expected. Marcus received the request with mild surprise, not because of its content, but because of its tone. It was direct, respectful, and notably absent of hierarchy. He agreed and adjusted his schedule. Without hesitation, when he entered Victoria's office later that afternoon, the dynamic felt different from their previous meetings. There was no audience, no agenda projected on a screen, just two chairs angled toward each other and a cityscape beyond the glass. Victoria began by outlining the situation, speaking candidly about the uncertainties involved. She did not ask him to solve it, only to share his perspective. Marcus listened carefully, absorbing not just the facts, but the shift in her approach. He responded thoughtfully, acknowledging the complexity and offering insight grounded in experience rather than authority. He spoke about alignment, about the importance of timing and communication, about how people responded when they felt included rather than directed. Victoria listened without interrupting, noticing how naturally the conversation unfolded when she allowed space instead of control. She asked follow-up questions, not to challenge, but to understand, and with each exchange, the distance she once maintained diminished further. When the discussion ended, Victoria thanked him again, but this time the gratitude was unmistakably sincere. Marcus nodded, preparing to leave, but she stopped him briefly, asking how he had learned to navigate complexity with such calm. The question caught her by surprise as much as it did him. Marcus answered honestly, explaining that his life had required balance long before boardrooms entered it. That responsibility sharpened perspective when others depended on you daily. Victoria absorbed this quietly, recognizing a depth she had not previously considered. After he left, she remained seated, reflecting on the ease of the interaction. It unsettled her not because it challenged her authority, but because it revealed how unnecessary that armor had been in that moment. Over the next few days, the change became more apparent. Victoria consulted Marcus before finalizing decisions, sometimes formally, sometimes through brief exchanges that carried weight far beyond their length. Marcus did not overstep. He did not assert influence. He simply remained present and reliable. The organization responded subtly. Conversations grew more transparent, teams aligned more quickly, and trust deepened without announcement. Victoria noticed that her stress levels eased even as responsibilities grew. She slept better, delegated more thoughtfully, and began measuring success differently, not solely by outcomes, but by stability. One evening, reviewing a particularly complex decision that had gone smoothly, she recognized a truth she could no longer avoid. She had begun relying on Marcus, not because he demanded it, but because his presence provided something her leadership had lacked: grounded clarity. The realization was both humbling and disquieting. She remembered the ease with which she had once dismissed him, and felt the weight of that moment press against her conscience. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his routines unchanged. He balanced work with home life, guided by principles that did not shift with recognition. He sensed the growing reliance, but did not define himself by it, knowing that true influence did not require acknowledgement to exist. As the days passed, Victoria found herself anticipating their conversations, not for reassurance, but for alignment. She trusted his perspective in ways she had once reserved only for herself, and though she had not spoken the words aloud, the truth was clear in her actions. The man she once labeled unworthy had become essential, and the power she wielded now felt incomplete without his steady presence beside it. The silence between them began to carry meaning, not the awkward kind born of uncertainty, but the steady quiet that follows trust. Victoria Hale noticed it first during a late afternoon meeting when she paused mid-sentence and instinctively looked toward Marcus Reed, waiting, not for approval, but for confirmation that her reasoning aligned with reality. Marcus did not speak immediately. He listened, considered, and then offered a brief observation that clarified the issue without redirecting. Authority. The room adjusted accordingly, and the discussion moved forward with renewed focus. Afterward, Victoria realized how natural the moment had felt, how easily she had deferred without feeling diminished. The realization unsettled her because it challenged a belief she had held for years, that leadership required constant assertion. Over the following weeks, this pattern repeated itself. Marcus became a quiet reference point, consulted in moments of uncertainty, trusted without ceremony. His influence expanding through absence of ego rather than presence of force. He never reminded anyone of his value, never leveraged trust for advantage. His restraint amplified his credibility. Victoria found herself thinking before speaking now, considering how decisions would land across the organization, a habit shaped largely by Marcus's steady perspective. One evening, reviewing a complex proposal, she called him unexpectedly, not to ask for a solution, but to ask if something felt off. Marcus listened over the phone, asked a few clarifying questions, and then gently pointed out an assumption that had gone unchecked. Victoria adjusted the proposal accordingly. The next day the plan was approved without resistance. She felt relief, but also a growing awareness of dependence that made her uncomfortable, not because it weakened her position, but because it forced her to confront how easily she had dismissed him before. Marcus remained unchanged by the shift. He continued, balancing responsibilities with the same measured approach, ensuring his child's needs were met, maintaining routines that anchored him regardless of professional dynamics. He did not interpret Victoria's reliance as victory or validation. He saw it as responsibility, knowing that trust, once given, carried weight. The organization responded to his presence subtly. Tensions eased, communication improved, and people spoke more openly, sensing that clarity was valued over performance. Victoria observed these changes with mixed emotion, pride in the stability achieved, and discomfort at recognizing how much it depended on someone she had once judged unfairly. Late one night, alone in her office, she replayed that initial moment again, the word unworthy echoing in her mind with new resonance. It no longer felt like a statement of fact, but a reflection of her own limitations at the time. She realized that Marcus had never attempted to correct her, never demanded acknowledgement or apology. His silence had been deliberate, allowing her to arrive at truth without coercion. The understanding deepened her respect and sharpened her self-scrutiny. The next day, during a brief exchange in the hallway, Victoria thanked Marcus again for his insight on a recent issue. He acknowledged the thanks with a simple nod. No deflection, no expectation. The exchange underscored what had become increasingly clear. His value lay not in recognition, but in consistency. As the weeks passed, Victoria found herself increasingly aware of how often she sought his perspective before making decisions. The reliance was no longer subtle, it was ingrained, and while she had not spoken the words aloud, her actions conveyed them clearly. She trusted him, depended on him, and respected him in ways that contradicted her earliest judgment. Marcus sensed the shift, but remained grounded, understanding that the most powerful transformations were often silent, built through patience rather than confrontation. And as the distance between dismissal and dependence narrowed completely, both stood on the edge of a reckoning that would require more than quiet understanding, a reckoning that would soon demand acknowledgement, not of success, but of truth. The realization did not arrive as a single moment of clarity, but as an accumulation of undeniable truths. Victoria Hale began noticing how often her thoughts now included Marcus Reed before decisions even reached her desk. She anticipated his questions, weighed his perspective instinctively, and adjusted her reasoning accordingly. What unsettled her was not that she valued his input, but that she had come to rely on it without conscious choice. One morning, preparing for a high-stakes presentation to external stakeholders, she reviewed the material repeatedly, yet something felt incomplete. Rather than pushing forward as she once would have, she stopped and called Marcus, asking him to review the structure, not the numbers, but the assumptions behind them. Marcus listened carefully, asked a few questions, and identified a subtle disconnect between intent and messaging. The correction was simple, but its impact was significant. The presentation later unfolded smoothly, confidence restored not by authority, but by alignment. As Victoria accepted congratulations afterward, she felt a quiet discomfort, knowing that success had been shared even if credit was not publicly assigned. Throughout the following days, this pattern repeated, decisions improved, tension decreased, and outcomes stabilized. Yet each improvement reinforced a truth Victoria could no longer ignore. She had been wrong about Marcus from the beginning, not partially wrong, but fundamentally mistaken. The word she had used, unworthy, now felt heavy with meaning, not as an insult to him, but as a mirror reflecting her own blind spots. She realized that her judgment had not been based on evidence, but on convenience, on assumptions shaped by environment and expectation. The recognition unsettled her deeply, because it challenged the foundation of her confidence. Marcus, meanwhile, remained steady, unaware of the internal reckoning unfolding above him. He continued offering perspective when asked, never pressing for acknowledgement. His sense of self anchored in values that did not fluctuate with external validation. His life outside work remained unchanged. Routines with his child provided clarity and purpose that grounded every other role he played. One evening, Victoria stayed late at the office, reviewing the day's events in silence. The city below buzzed with movement, yet her thoughts were still. She replayed the first interaction with Marcus in her mind, the ease with which she had dismissed him, the certainty she had felt, and the lack of hesitation in her voice. The memory now filled her with discomfort, not because she feared judgment, but because she recognized the harm of unchecked authority. She understood then that her success had insulated her from self-examination, allowing confidence to harden into assumption. Marcus's presence had disrupted that pattern not through challenge, but through consistency. He had forced her to confront the limits of her perspective simply by existing outside it. The following day, during a quiet moment between meetings, Victoria found herself watching Marcus interact with colleagues, his calm demeanor, his attentive listening, the respect he earned without demanding it, and the trust others placed in him freely. She saw clearly now what she had missed before. His strength lay not in visibility, but in reliability, not in command, but in care. The realization settled fully, leaving no room for denial. She needed him, not as a subordinate, not as a symbol, but as a stabilizing force she could not replace. The dependence was not weakness, but acknowledgement, and acknowledging it required humility she had long avoided. Marcus sensed a shift in her presence during their next interaction, a subtle weight in her words, a pause before she spoke. As if she were choosing honesty over instinct, she asked his opinion on a matter she would once have decided alone, and when he responded, she listened fully, without preparing a rebuttal. In that moment, the truth crystallized for her. She had spent years believing she saved others through leadership, but now she saw that she herself had been steadied, guided, and corrected by the man she once deemed unworthy. The realization did not diminish her, it clarified her, and as she walked back to her office afterward, Victoria understood that the next step would not be easy, because awareness demanded accountability, and accountability required more than silent reliance. It required facing the truth she had tried to outgrow, that her greatest growth had come not from power exercised, but from power questioned, and that Marcus Reed had become essential not by force, but by character. The dependence became visible not through a dramatic confession but through necessity, a convergence of pressure and timing that stripped away pretense. Hale Dynamics faced a sudden regulatory inquiry that demanded immediate clarification across multiple divisions. Nothing catastrophic, but complex enough to expose every weakness if mishandled. Victoria Hale received the notice early in the morning, read it carefully, and felt the familiar urge to take full control rise within her. Yet instead of acting alone, she paused, recognizing that speed without alignment would only deepen the problem. Almost instinctively now, she reached out to Marcus Reed, asking him to review the scope and help coordinate a response, not as an assistant, not as an advisor hidden in the margins, but as a central presence in the process. Marcus agreed and arrived shortly after, his demeanor unchanged, steady and focused. He listened as Victoria outlined the situation, noting timelines, expectations, and the unspoken anxiety threading through her words. He asked measured questions, not to assert authority, but to ensure clarity, then began organizing the response logically, identifying where information lived, who needed to speak, and how to ensure consistency without panic. Victoria watched him work and felt a quiet relief settle in, not because the problem disappeared, but because she was no longer carrying it alone. Throughout the day, they worked in close coordination, exchanging updates, adjusting approaches, and ensuring transparency at every step. Victoria noticed how often she deferred to his judgment on pacing and tone, trusting his instincts without hesitation. When a decision point arose, she asked his opinion before finalizing it, something she once would have resisted, and each time, his perspective steadied the outcome. By evening, the response was complete, thorough, and calm, the inquiry addressed without escalation. As the final documents were sent, Victoria exhaled, the tension easing from her shoulders. She realized then that her reliance on Marcus was no longer subtle or theoretical. It was functional and immediate. She had depended on him to navigate uncertainty, and he had delivered without seeking credit or control. The realization carried weight, not as embarrassment, but as clarity. Later, alone in her office, Victoria reflected on the day, the smooth coordination, the absence of chaos, and the quiet competence that had anchored everything. She acknowledged a truth she could no longer soften. She trusted Marcus more than she trusted her own instincts in moments of uncertainty, not because she doubted herself, but because she recognized the value of balance he brought. The dependence was no longer an internal realization, it was evident in her actions. Marcus, meanwhile, concluded his day with the same routines that defined his life. He returned home, prepared dinner, listened to his child recount the day with enthusiasm, and offered reassurance when worries surfaced. These moments reminded him why steadiness mattered, why responsibility shaped perspective. He did not reflect on the significance of the workday, because for him, fulfillment came from consistency rather than recognition. The following morning, Victoria requested a brief meeting with Marcus, not to discuss tasks, but to debrief. They spoke candidly about what had worked and what could improve. The conversation flowed easily, marked by mutual respect rather than hierarchy. Victoria thanked him again, her tone sincere, and added that she could not imagine navigating the situation without his presence. The words hung between them, unadorned and honest. Marcus acknowledged them quietly, understanding the weight they carried. The statement marked a turning point, not because it elevated him, but because it confirmed what had already been demonstrated. Victoria Hale, a woman accustomed to independence and control, had openly acknowledged reliance. The dependence reshaped her leadership, not weakening it, but grounding it in humility. She recognized that strength did not diminish when shared, it expanded. Marcus sensed the shift, but remained unchanged, knowing that true partnership required constancy rather than celebration. As the days continued, their collaboration became seamless, decisions made with clarity, challenges addressed with balance, and trust reinforced through action. Victoria understood now that the man she once dismissed had become integral not through demand, but through reliability, and that her success, once defined by solitary authority, now rested on shared accountability. The dependence was real, visible, and transformative, and it prepared her for the final reckoning still ahead, one that would require not just acknowledgement of need, but acknowledgement of harm, and the courage to face it honestly. The reckoning arrived without warning, not as an accusation from others, but as an unavoidable moment of self-confrontation. Victoria Hale found herself alone in the quiet of her office late one evening, the building nearly empty, the city lights below reflecting a version of herself she no longer fully recognized. The events of the past weeks replayed in her mind with increasing clarity, the reliance she had developed, the trust she had extended, and the stability Marcus Reed had provided, without ever asking for acknowledgement. Yet one moment stood apart from the rest, unresolved and heavy. The first day she had dismissed him with a single word, unworthy. The memory no longer felt distant, it pressed against her conscience with urgency she could no longer ignore. She realized that growth without accountability was incomplete, and that the leadership she was becoming required facing the harm she had caused, even if it had not been intentional. The following morning, she asked Marcus to meet with her privately. The request carried a weight she could not mask. Marcus agreed, sensing the gravity without speculation. When he entered her office, the atmosphere was different, not tense, but deliberate. Victoria did not begin with business. She did not reference metrics or plans. Instead, she spoke slowly. Choosing honesty over authority, she acknowledged the journey they had taken together, the trust that had formed, and the reliance she had placed on him. Then she paused, her voice steady but unguarded, and addressed the moment she had avoided naming. She spoke about the first meeting, the judgment she had passed, and the words she had used. She did not justify it, did not soften it. She named it plainly and accepted responsibility for it. The room felt still as she spoke, not because of discomfort, but because of truth finally given space. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression calm, attentive. When she finished, she did not ask for forgiveness. She did not seek absolution. She simply acknowledged that her words had been wrong and that the impact mattered. Marcus took a moment before responding, his silence not punitive, but reflective. He spoke with clarity, explaining that he had understood her judgment in the context of her world, but that understanding did not erase its weight. He shared that he had chosen silence not because he accepted the label, but because he trusted time to reveal truth more effectively than confrontation. His words carried no resentment, only perspective. Victoria listened fully, absorbing not just the content, but the restraint behind it. She realized then that his dignity had never depended on her acknowledgement, but her growth had depended on his patience. The conversation did not end with resolution wrapped neatly in words, but with mutual understanding grounded in honesty. Victoria thanked him again, not as a leader to a subordinate, but as one person to another. Marcus acknowledged it with a quiet nod. The exchange marked a turning point, not because the past was erased, but because it was finally addressed. In the days that followed, the change within Victoria became visible in subtle ways. She spoke with greater care, listened with deeper intent, and modeled accountability without spectacle. The organization responded, trust strengthened, and conversations grew more open. Marcus continued his work unchanged, consistent in his approach, grounded in values that had guided him long before recognition arrived. He did not revisit the past content that it had been acknowledged honestly. His focus remained on responsibility rather than resolution. One evening, Victoria reflected on the conversation, understanding that facing her mistake had not weakened her, it had clarified her leadership. She recognized that true authority was not diminished by admitting error, but strengthened by integrity. Marcus, meanwhile, returned home to the routines that defined his life, present and attentive, knowing that dignity did not require vindication to exist. As their paths continued forward, the unspoken weight of the past no longer lingered between them, replaced by a shared understanding built on respect, accountability, and truth. Victoria knew that the final measure of her growth was not the success she achieved, but the humility she embraced, and that the man she had once dismissed had taught her that lesson not through challenge, but through character. The reckoning had passed, leaving behind not regret, but resolve, and preparing both of them for the final chapter that would define not just their roles, but their values. The final shift revealed itself not through announcement or ceremony, but through the quiet establishment of a new order, one built on clarity rather than correction. Hale dynamics continued forward with renewed stability. Decisions flowed with less friction, communication carried intention, and leadership no longer relied solely on command but on coherence. Victoria Hale moved through her days with a presence that felt lighter yet more grounded. She no longer measured strength by how firmly she stood alone, but by how well she aligned those around her. The lessons she had absorbed reshaped her instincts. She listened first, spoke with care, and modeled accountability without spectacle. Her authority remained unquestioned, but it now carried credibility rooted in humility. Marcus Reed continued in his role, without change in title or posture, his influence steady and unassuming. He did not seek elevation, recognition, or validation, because his sense of worth had never depended on external acknowledgement. Colleagues approached him with trust. Conversations found clarity in his presence, and outcomes reflected his consistency. Yet he remained anchored in the life that mattered most to him, returning home each evening to routines defined by care, responsibility, and presence. The balance he maintained became the quiet center from which all else extended. One afternoon, during a company-wide briefing, Victoria addressed the organization with transparency about the values guiding their progress. She spoke of alignment, trust, and shared responsibility, without naming individuals or revisiting the past. Yet her gaze paused briefly on Marcus, not as a gesture of recognition, but of acknowledgement. The message was clear without being stated. Value was no longer assigned by perception, but by contribution. The room responded not with applause, but with attentiveness, a sign that culture had shifted at its core. Later that day, Victoria and Marcus crossed paths in the hallway, exchanged a brief nod, and continued on their respective paths. No words were needed. The respect between them was settled, complete, and mutual. The power dynamic that once defined their interaction had dissolved, replaced by equilibrium. Victoria understood now that leadership did not require dominance to be effective, and Marcus understood that dignity did not require defense to endure. As weeks turned into months, the company's success continued, but it no longer felt fragile. It rested on systems designed for resilience rather than control. Victoria reflected often on the journey that had brought her here, the certainty she once carried, the judgment she had passed, and the patience that had allowed her to see beyond it. She recognized that her growth had been guided not by confrontation, but by the steady presence of someone who embodied values she had overlooked. Marcus never revisited the past, content that truth had revealed itself without force. His silence had not been submission, but confidence in time, and time had done its work. One evening, as Victoria prepared to leave the office, she paused at the window overlooking the city, the lights below steady and expansive. She felt a quiet gratitude, not for being corrected, but for being allowed to grow without humiliation. Marcus, walking home under the same city lights, felt no need for reflection, his path clear, his purpose steady. The story between them did not end with reversal or triumph, but with balance restored. The labels that once defined perception held no power now, replaced by understanding earned through consistency. The woman who once judged learned to listen, and the man who was judged never needed to prove. In the end, the truth stood without explanation. Worth was not granted by authority nor diminished by dismissal. It revealed itself through character, and when it did, it reordered everything quietly, permanently, and without need for further words.